Why would Hans Holbein the Younger place death itself directly behind a judge at the very moment he is dispensing justice? Unless the point was that no verdict, however powerful, escapes the final one. This is a woodcut by Hans Holbein the Younger, made around 1526, part of his celebrated Dance of Death series designed in Basel. A robed judge seated on a raised throne gestures toward a standing figure who holds coins on a plate, suggesting bribery, while a skeletal death looms behind the judge gripping a sword, and two additional figures crowd the left side of the composition beneath an architectural arcade. The series, which Holbein designed to be cut by Hans Lutzelberger, became one of the most influential print cycles of the Reformation era, using death as a satirical leveler to expose corruption across every rank of society. In an age when no one, not even the most powerful man in Christendom, could claim immunity from death, Hans Holbein the Younger made that truth uncomfortably visible by placing a grinning skeleton directly behind the Pope's throne. This woodcut, designed by Holbein around 1526 and cut by Hans Lutzelberger, belongs to Holbein's celebrated Dance of Death series, one of the most influential print cycles produced in 16th century Germany. The title Der Papst appears at the top, and the scene shows an enthroned pope in triple crown preparing to place a crown on a kneeling figure. While death lurks at his shoulder clutching a key, a skeletal figure in papal robes stands at the right, and a winged demon perches in the background amid processional crosses and attendant clergy. Created during the turbulent years of the Reformation, when the authority of the papacy was under fierce attack, Holbein's image carried a charge that went far beyond memento mori, the suggestion that death itself had already taken the Pope's place. Why would one of the most sought-after court painters of the 16th century spend years designing a series in which death humiliates the most powerful people alive? Pope, emperor, king, and nobleman alike. This woodcut, designed by Hans Holbein the Younger and cut by Hans Lutzelberger, dates to around 1526 and belongs to Holbein's celebrated Dance of Death series, produced in Basel during a period of intense religious and social upheaval. A richly dressed nobleman in a feathered hat and slashed doublet reaches for his sword, but a grinning skeleton has already seized his arm and steals his blade from behind, while a sandglass on a low table to the left marks the last grains of his time running out. The series was a radical reimagining of the medieval dance macabre tradition. Holbein stripped away the literal dance and replaced it with ambush, making death not a partner but a predator, and the Lutzelberger blocks survive as some of the finest examples of the woodcutter's art ever produced. When Hans Holbein the Younger designed this series in the 1520s, he made a radical choice. Death comes for everyone equally, regardless of rank, wealth, or civic power, and no office offers protection. This is a woodcut by Hans Holbein the Younger, made around 1526 in Basel, part of his celebrated Dance of Death series, one of the most influential printed morality cycles of the Renaissance. The Councillor stands at center in his robes of office, gesturing toward a supplicant who approaches from the right, while behind him a skeletal death crouches at his feet clutching an hourglass, and above, a winged devil perches gleefully on his shoulders. Holbein's genius was to embed this ancient memento mori theme within recognizably contemporary civic life, turning each vignette into a pointed social critique that spoke directly to the corruption and complacency of the powerful in Reformation-era Europe. Hans Holbein the Younger designed his Dance of Death series at a moment when plague, war, and religious upheaval made death feel less like a distant theology and more like a daily neighbor. And he made it clear that death comes for everyone, including the most vulnerable. This woodcut, designed by Holbein around 1526 and cut by Hans Lutzelberger, is one of 41 small but extraordinarily detailed images from the series, produced in Basel, Switzerland. The title inscription reads Das alte Weib, the old woman, and depicts a bent, cloaked elderly woman leaning on a crutch while a grinning skeleton wearing a leafy crown grabs her arm and raises its hand triumphantly, with a second skeleton playing a hurdy-gurdy visible behind them in a rocky, windswept landscape. What makes the series so enduring is Holbein's refusal of sentiment. The skeleton does not merely visit the old woman, it mocks her, crowning itself with foliage as if in celebration, and the precision of Lutzelberger's cutting renders every rib, every fold of cloth, with a clarity that gives the image its unsettling intimacy, even at miniature scale. What comfort is there, in a room full of gold, when death itself has come to count your coins? This woodcut, designed by Hans Holbein the Younger around 1526, is one of the celebrated series known as the Dance of Death, produced in Basel at a moment of intense religious and social upheaval. A wealthy man recoils in horror, one hand raised in desperate protest, as a skeletal figure leans across the counting table to scoop up a platter of coins, money bags and strongboxes heaped on the floor below. Holbein's series was revolutionary in democratizing the medieval dance of death tradition, showing that no rank, from pope to peasant, escapes the same fate. And the razor-sharp line work of these woodcuts, later engraved by Hans Lutzelberger, gave the images a biting psychological clarity that made them among the most widely reproduced prints of the 16th century. Why would one of the most celebrated portrait painters of the Northern Renaissance devote years of meticulous effort to imagining death ambushing the powerful, the pious, and the poor? This woodcut is from Hans Holbein the Younger's Dance of Death series, produced around 1526, a sequence of small but extraordinarily refined images designed and cut in Basel, Switzerland. A richly dressed count, wearing an extravagant feathered hat and fur-trimmed cape, strides forward while a skeletal death sneaks up behind him, stealing his hat and clutching a lance, with a second skeleton sprawled at his feet amid scattered armor and a toppled crown. Holbein's series was a landmark in the long tradition of Totentanz imagery because it abandoned the medieval convention of death leading victims in a procession, replacing it with something far more unsettling. Sudden, private, and darkly comic ambushes that made no exceptions for rank or wealth. Hans Holbein the Younger made this image during the Reformation, a moment when the idea that death strips away all rank and privilege was not just a moral lesson, but a genuinely radical one. This woodcut is from Holbein's Dance of Death series, designed around 1526 in Basel, cut by Hans Lutzelberger, and later published in Lyon in 1538. A crowned duchess sits upright on an ornate canopied bed, her robes pooled around her, while a skeletal figure plays a fiddle at her feet and a second skeleton reaches toward her from behind a bedpost, pulling at her shroud. The series is one of the most influential print cycles in Western art, and this image is a masterpiece of the form. Holbein packs an entire moral universe into a space no larger than a playing card, using the woodcut's stark contrast to make death feel not distant, but immediate, almost domestic. At a time when plague and war could end a life before the harvest came in, Hans Holbein the Younger chose to show death not visiting kings and bishops alone, but seizing a peasant mid-furrow, a radical insistence that no labor, however humble, exempts a person from mortality. This woodcut, made by Holbein around 1526 in Basel, is one image from his celebrated Dance of Death series, a sequence of small prints that would become among the most widely reproduced images of the 16th century. In the foreground, a broad-hatted ploughman strains against the handles of a wheeled plough drawn by two horses, while a skeletal death drives the team forward with a whip, gleefully usurping the farmer's own role. Behind them, furrowed fields recede toward a village and a church tower catching the rays of a rising sun. Holbein's genius here lies in the bitter irony of the composition. Death does not interrupt the ploughman's work, but performs it, turning the very act of sustaining life into the instrument of its end. Hans Holbein the Younger designed this woodcut as part of a series so subversive in its mockery of pope, emperor, and clergy that no printer in Germany would touch it for nearly a decade after its completion. It is a woodcut from around 1526, cut by the master block cutter Hans Lutzelberger after Holbein's designs, produced in Basel. The image presents death's heraldic coat of arms flanked by two human supporters, a cloaked man and an elegantly dressed woman, while a skeleton's bony arms hold crossed bones and an hourglass above a crowned shield bearing a skull on a draped escutcheon. the whole composed as a formal heraldic achievement. Giving death its own coat of arms, the ultimate aristocratic symbol of lineage and status, was a pointed joke that no rank of society could ignore, and it set the sardonic tone for the entire Dance of Death series that would become one of the most reproduced and influential print cycles of the 16th century.